Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Livermore. This episode is sponsored by the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment at the University of Virginia School of Law. With me today is Paul Stephan, my colleague here at UVA Law. He's a comparative and international law expert, and he's author of the new book, The World Crisis in International Law, The Knowledge Economy, and the Battle for the Future, which was recently published by Cambridge University Press. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, unrest in global energy markets, the ongoing turmoil associated with COVID, we do seem to have plenty to worry about these days. And I take the book project in part to be an excavation of the root causes of the current state of affairs. My takeaway, very broadly, my thumbnail version, was that the project of what you call in the book international liberalism was for a long time mutually reinforced by the growth of another phenomenon, which is the knowledge economy, but that ultimately features of the knowledge economy have kind of arisen that undermine the international liberal project. And the result is that international institutions are failing, and maybe the project of peace and prosperity is failing as well, or at least we have reason to be worried. Given the focus of the podcast on environmental issues, I would like to talk at some point about what all this means for climate change, which you do touch on in the book. But maybe to just get our feet under us, let's start with some definitions. So one is that sketch roughly fair? And maybe, what are you referring to when you talk about international liberalism and a concept like the knowledge economy?
So you said it very well, Michael, probably better than I could. The only thing that I would add to the equation is liberal democracy at home. So I think there is a strong connection between liberal democracy at home and liberal internationalism. And the knowledge economy, as I understand it, has been undermining both, even though the liberal project and the knowledge economy have a lot to share.
And so when you talk about, let's start with the knowledge economy. So what are we talking about when you refer to that? Obviously, knowledge is an important part of the economy. It has been for a long time. What's different now than, say, obviously intellectual property has been with us for a long time. What has shifted over the last several decades to bring into shape this force that you're calling the knowledge economy?
Yeah, so you're right that the insight is actually fairly old. The formula that economists use is that economic growth is tied to capital, labor, and X. X being called innovation because we don't know what else to call it. And over the last 50, 60 years, I think from the scholarly perspective, we've gotten more insight into what we mean when we talk about innovation, what it looks like and what its characteristics are. And one of the reasons why economists have been as focused on this as they have over the last 50, 60 years is because it, by any measure, has had a significant impact in the structure of how we do things, both in terms of production and of products. That's to say, the world increasingly uses knowledge as an input, as a factor adding value to things. And also, if it's a valuable input, then you would expect us to produce more of it. And we also see knowledge as a product in the economy. So putting it at a very abstract level, the knowledge economy is the increasing reliance on a conceptual approach to the world as opposed to manipulating physical things as a way of adding value to what, in a very broad sense, we in the world make.
So is the end state of the knowledge economy like the metaverse, where we don't manipulate anything in the world? All we manipulate is symbols and ownership and NFTs, and that's the whole, that's some huge part of the economy. Is that the in extremis version of the knowledge economy?
Yeah, so in extremis that I might even take it off the table as so far in the distance that we can't really talk about it in any at least analytical fashion. It's a great exercise of imagination, but I think that's a little, with all due respect to Facebook, I think that's a little, I'm sorry, Microsoft, right? It's Microsoft.
Facebook is Meta. I mean, everyone's in the space to a certain extent. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think we don't have to go down the road quite that far. I mean, I use as an example, I think, of a very interesting facet of the knowledge economy is containerized shipping. I mean, the tech is pretty uninteresting. It was mostly developed by the 1920s, but it wasn't until the 50s and 60s that people figured out how to use containerization at scale as a way of solving some very significant logistical problems. And it happened to coincide with changes in communication and information processing technology, which facilitated containerization. So we have, in sum, a huge increase in the added value of the distribution of goods around the world as opposed to local production. And it's not what we think of as high tech, but it really is very much based on a knowledge breakthrough that was implemented very concretely in the world.
Yeah. So, okay, great. Maybe just to hold with this for a second before we get into some other terms. Obviously, as you note, and the containerized shipping is a really interesting example. So knowledge and innovation and technology has always been part of the economy since fire, right? And wheels and stuff, all of the basic mechanics, the printing press. And so what characterizes, we could say that the Neolithic societies were knowledge-based economies to a certain extent, in that knowledge and technology was absolutely essential to production at the time. So what's different about today and the structure of our economy today? Is it just that the percentage of value add that comes from innovation and technology is so much higher? Is it that the pace of innovation and change is higher? Is it the reason I brought up Meta is that, is there an element of dematerialization of the economy that didn't exist before? What is the character of the kind of contemporary knowledge economy that's distinct from, what happened in the early 20th century, or what was going on in the early 19th century, for that matter, where obviously technology still had a huge role in structuring how economic activity functioned?
So I think your first point captures it best, or at least is the one I agree with the most. That's to say, it's not that there's anything really new under the sun about innovation as such, but simply its contribution to value added across the board in the world economy has grown considerably, to a point where it's become the driver of decisions to a much greater extent. I mean, Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu's book about the internet back in, I think it was 1999, they go back to a press story in 1899 that talks about long-distance telephones as an example of the dematerialization of society. And people regarded the invention of the phonograph very much the same way. So there's nothing new about the dematerialization. What's new, I think, is just the scale of it and the growing reliance on it in the world economy.
Got it. Okay, great. So let's just get some of our other terms on the table. So another that is a big theme in the book is international liberalism, and that's a term that's not totally coined here, but there are other phrases that sometimes stand in for similar ideas. Some of which you don't like, some of which I might not like. but other people love, right? So neoliberalism or globalization are sometimes used to describe similar suites of policies or institutions or occurrences or phenomenon. So why do you like what do you mean by international liberalism, I guess? Let's start with that. And then why do you like that as a description of, the phenomena that you're interested in, as opposed to these other terms that are often used?
So there's always a risk when you try and push something that's not quite the mainstream term, that there might be confusion. I might be accused of trying to evade some of the unfortunate implications of some of those concepts. So to take neoliberalism, the reason I don't embrace that is A, I'm not sure entirely what it means, and B, certainly there are important sectors of the world, including friends of ours, who consider it to be an epithet. So I'm trying to at least dodge some of the stigma. And globalizations, as I say, the problem with globalization, I think, is that it is too much. Too often regarded as an input when I see it as an output. That is to say, I see globalization as a series of predictable but by no means inevitable policy responses to certain changes in the method of production. So I see the knowledge economy as something that makes scaling, it does two things. One is it makes scaling more valuable because knowledge scales, right? It's very expensive to produce, but very low cost to transmit.
Right. Phonograph is a good example of that.
Yeah. And the other, I think, important aspect of the knowledge economy that we don't take into account often enough is its focus on talent as the principal component of a person's identity. The knowledge economy thrives on talent, however you define it. And a corollary of that is it's hostile to anything that gets in the way of the realization of talent. So things that we, I think, quite rightly have been seeking to repress in the course of my lifetime, certainly, racism, sexism, homophobia, just to name the things that are most on people's minds today. There's a very strong justice case for those things, but there's also an economic case once you buy into the knowledge economy. They all get in the way of the realization of talent. Yeah. So we have these two features which I think the reason that we have liberal internationalism is because knowledge scales, and therefore we want production and markets to be international. Because you increase the size of the market, and the cost of meeting the demand from the increased size market doesn't go up commensurately because knowledge scales. And we want the cost of production in terms of talent to be lower. And one way to do that is to get rid of barriers to the expression of talent. So all these things that we object to for many good reasons, they also happen to be rewarded by the knowledge economy.
Great. And so, and as part of that response, you said the reason we have international liberalism is, because it essentially unfetters the knowledge economy or acts to reduce barriers to talent and scalability, which are kind of core elements of the knowledge economy. So is that the worldview here that's underlying that's kind of informing your project? Is the kind of economic realities drove the political processes, maybe that then generated international liberalism, which maybe we should just note. What I take that to be is, essentially the set of institutions and norms that surrounded basically the global trade system with the WTO, and that's the World Trade Organization, and the GATT at its foundation. So maybe we could just start with, what are we talking about when we're talking about international liberalism and its relationship to trade? And then this kind of second question is, there's a symbiotic relationship, or at least there had been a symbiotic relationship between the knowledge economy and international liberalism. And I guess, which one's the tail and which one's the dog of that? Is it the policies that facilitated the knowledge economy? Is it the knowledge economy that then drove the policies, or was it just a mutually beneficial feedback that was occurring over time?
Yeah, since I'm not trained as an economist, I can't really propose a clear causal relationship. I mean, I would refer your listeners to Brad DeLong's superb new book, Slouching Towards Utopia, which I think goes into much greater historical detail than me and does propose a causal argument in which he links the modern knowledge economy to a number of important things, including corporate research.
Yeah.
As an example. But to answer your question as to what we mean when we talk about the concrete expression of liberal internationalism, I think the four freedoms, that is to say, freedom of movement of goods, freedom of services, freedom of capital, and freedom of the movement of people across barriers. And the legal systems that have been developed, at least greatly enhanced since the start of the 90s, although the concepts have been around much longer. And the EU is an example, as was the United States, of implementing those freedoms locally or regionally. And what we've been trying to do since the end of the Cold War is to extend those four freedoms to the entire world.
Okay, good. So this is the project of international liberalism, right?
Yep.
Is to build but there's an institutional component to this, right? So it's that we could say substantively these are the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people are the end goal. But there's then this overlay of institutions and agreements and international law, right? Because at some level, that's a big focus of the book. And so I guess maybe that's the way to get at this is what role does law play in that? So we've got the economy, right? We've got the substantive project of facilitating global movement and goods, services, capital, and people. And then what's the institutional or legal manifestation of that?
Right. So my intuitions are formed essentially by Marxism, quite honestly. That is to say, the one piece of Marxism that seems to me entirely right is that the base dictates superstructure. But having said that, I think that is a perspective. It's not objective reality. It's a useful way of making sense of the world for me, but I won't maintain that it's the only way of understanding these things. But if you understand that these ideas we develop about how to make things skew, change economic incentives, and then we design legal institutions to some extent to reflect those incentives. We don't always respond to incentives, but we do a lot. And to be concrete, the institutions that were developed in the two sectors during the Cold War, that's to say, both the Soviet side and the United States and its allies built institutions to promote their separate conceptions of development, the four freedoms in the case of the West, and greater central planning in the case of what I call the South, if you can accept a South that includes the Soviet Union and China. That what happened after 1989, I'm being arbitrary in using that date, but it's vivid, is extending the Western side's institutional approach to globally. So part of that is by accepting new members to the systems that had served the West, the GATT, the World Bank, the
Global
IMF.
Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, right? Just for our listeners. Yep.
Yeah, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The idea of investment protection through bilateral investment treaties that had developed really going back to the 40s, but it's really after the 80s that it takes on, first of all, the new feature of giving investors a private right of action against states, which had not existed before, and two, everybody joining in, so that we take legal projects that were regional and became increasingly global. I think human rights is part of that for many reasons, but one reason that I argue is tied to the knowledge economy is the point that suppression of arbitrary obstacles to the realization of talent is a project of the knowledge economy, and I think that is one of the reasons, by no means the sole reason, one of the explanations for the proliferation of human rights regimes on a global basis.
Right. And so, okay, good. So we've got this kind of like picture of the world. There's 1989, we're moving into the post-Soviet era, the fall of at least European communism and communism in Russia, where the institutions of broadly the West, including around this notion of liberal internationalism and the free trade regimes. So these institutions are then expanded out to other parts of the world. And there was the idea that the rest of the system would follow, right? The human rights regimes, maybe liberal democracy. Of course, that was a theory at one point. It was that Russia and China, after adopting market reforms, we're going to rapidly shift over to, or at least on some timeline, we're going to shift over to liberal democratic political orders. And this was the vision, right? This is the end of history stuff, right? We're all going to live in this world. And the title of your book is The World Crisis. So things didn't work out quite as planned. And part of that, I take your diagnosis, is that although the knowledge economy jibes, let's just say, who knows about causal relationship, but it jibes with the project of liberal internationalism and maybe the project of liberal democracy, human rights, and the like, that there are also features of the knowledge economy that undermine this project that operate at cross purposes, at least to the institutions that are necessary to maintain the project. And so you mentioned scalability, and in the book, you talk about locally concentrated benefits, and these come about because, essentially, because of the importance of talent and the value of aggregation. So, good, talented people and companies and institutions cluster together in cities, where then that leads to lots and lots and lots of productivity happening in those cities, and you have scalability. So they can then sell their products to the whole world, and it's this kind of mutually reinforcing cycle. An economist might look at that and say that sounds great. So what are the downsides here that you see as ultimately having been a threat to the system? And I take it to be your claim that like these have threatened and will undo the system, at least to a certain extent.
Well, at a minimum, they pose very serious challenges. When you write a book for what I hope to be a broader audience than the law professors I usually write for, you need to be vivid. And the cost of being vivid, I think, is that you lose nuance, but sometimes nuance is boring. So what I'm trying to do here is to say we have some very serious challenges we're facing. And the purpose of the book is not to preach despair, but to say, let's face up to these challenges. Let's grow up here. Mm-hmm. So you're right that I think because I think it is true, knowledge is transmitted best locally. This is an observation of Alfred Marshall. It's an observation of the new institutional economists like Paul Krugman. The insight is that the benefits of the knowledge economy are not spread evenly, but rather you have what we can call knowledge clusters. And the sociologists in particular, people like Saskia Sassen, earlier Jane Jacobs, focus on the rise of cities, and Sassen in particular, global cities. And what we end up with is because of global economy, we have two complementary things. First of all, we divide the world into winners and losers. The global economy is a great economy to work in if you're talented, especially as it's working hard to erase the obstacles to the realization of talent that historical, cultural, arbitrary, unjust practices erected. And people with talent and a service class that supports people with talent congregate in cities. I mean, one of the features of the global economy that people like Sasson write about is that the great global cities have vast discrepancies of life opportunity, of wealth, if you will, partly because the people who migrate to these cities who are not the talented people, but people who simply are willing to do tasks for a lower price than incumbents, often immigrants, sometimes in many cases, both in the West and the South, there are people who have legally problematic status. In China and Russia, they don't have local passports. In Europe and the United States, they are undocumented aliens. And the precariousness of their legal status, the precariousness of a life that's being restarted without long connections or broad connections, makes those people vulnerable. And therefore the cost of making the lives of talented people easier go down. And people are willing to do that because, as exploited as they are in the great cities, it's still a better life than back in the countryside where they come from. I think this is as true in China and Russia as it is in Europe and the United States, true in India. But when you divide the world into winners and losers, and the distribution is local rather than evenly spread, so you have the people who are left behind, the Case and Deaton deaths of despair people, the people who are displaced increasingly by the knowledge economy, but not prepared to move into low reward service sectors, and instead have disrupted lives, disturbed lives, and to trust Case and Deaton's data, often have very downwardly spiraling lives. And these people, the winners and the losers, live in different places. They creating political conflict, creating division. Certainly in the affluent West, I see this. I think there's actually good data seeing this account as economical an explanation as any for both the Brexit vote and the Trump vote in 2016. You can see similar processes elsewhere in the world, and it also encourages revisionism among the states that were historically left out of the rich West. So that China is our best example, but India, South Africa, Russia, the so-called BRICS, are all seeking a revision in the international order that is, at least in part, a challenge to the legal institutions and commitments that undergird the international knowledge economy.
Right. So there's kind of two forces simultaneously at work. I think that's one of the things that's interesting. Argument in the book and a way of framing the current moment. There's internal, and there's always, of course, conflict in democracies, right? But there is conflict in democratic states like the United States. There's conflict in Europe. There's anti-globalization in particular. That's a term, right? We could say anti-international liberalism, but just the notion of skepticism in the EU about Europe as an entity, European Union institutions, obviously Brexit being the extreme example of this in the United States. Both political parties now have moved, there was a huge consensus, extending easily through Clinton into Bush Obama about the value of the project of international liberalism, and now the Trump severely disrupted that on the Republican side, and I think the Biden administration's in a very different posture these days than even the Obama administration, which obviously the current president was a huge part of. So there's that on the one hand, and then there's these international players, especially Russia, China. You mentioned there's also Brazil, India, countries like South Africa. So then I guess one question I have with respect to the second piece of this. So there's the internal, and then the within country, and then there's the kind of geopolitical, let's say, two different levels that kind of play into the same, they're forces that play into the same context. So you're a Russia expert. That's have you spent a big part of your career on, and we're obviously right now, really crazy things are happening in the context of Russia. A question that I have is a naive question, maybe, but maybe a way to get some traction on this is, why is Russia so interested in renegotiating the basic terms of this system, right? So, like, if international liberal internationalism is kind of a level playing field, and it allows for countries to, maximize based on their comparative advantages, and it's a way of, increasing, global economic output, and the rest. Is it just that Russia doesn't think it can compete in that environment? Does it think the rules are, structured against it? Like, what accounts for Russia's, pretty substantial at this point, I think, pretty clear oppositional, the way it's kind of positioned itself vis-a-vis the rest of the organized economic world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can throw out some conjectures, but that's all they are. I don't have any firm answers. I mean, one of Russia's many tragedies, I've said before, you can't do Russia without living with tragedy. It seems to be what they ultimately do the best. So one of the tragedies, probably inevitable, but that's what tragedy is a decision in the 80s and 90s to, rather than find ways to build social trust or social capital. I think the latter is just an economic term for the former. Russia was historically a low social capital country. It was a paradox because it was a high human capital country. That's to say, a high investment in the development of talent and skills, but in a social environment that was really inimical to cooperative behavior, which meant that the pathway they chose in the 80s and 90s was resource extraction as the basis of their economy, rather than disruptive innovation and production that would make smart people better off. That the definition of being smart in Russia meant being a better thief, a better embezzler, a better fraudster, rather than trying to create value. Or putting it differently, Russia's focus was much more on distribution of a fixed set of assets, many of which were in the ground, rather than trying to come up with a value added. And given the low social capital of the society as we find it in 1989, that may not be surprising, but it is really tragic given the huge resources of human talent that they could call on at that time. And China is a very interesting, different. The contrast between Russia and China is a country in China with vast human resources, some of which are high human capital, but certainly just a lot of people. Also devastated in terms of social trust due to, decades of misrule under Mao. But they seem to find a way of reaching a social consensus starting in the early 80s, where it's been so awful following the Maoist path that you will trust us to go in a different path, even though it's a very traumatized, harmed population. And they seem to have reached a burden where, we will trust our leaders, maybe from a Western liberal perspective excessively, as long as they provide prosperity, and the leadership understanding that prosperity based on knowledge is the real way of the future. So, even by the end of the 80s, the difference between China and Russia was really quite striking. And under Putin, Russia has just doubled down on that. Mm-hmm. And indeed, I think Russia much more than China sees the social and political divisions in the West that are, I believe, in part a consequence of the knowledge economy as a vulnerability to be exploited. Mm-hmm. So I think although China sees itself as our competitor and to some extent the West's adversary, it doesn't, I think, interfere with disinformation and provocative behavior, of which the invasion of Ukraine is the most extreme manifestation. The Russians are, going for broke while mm-hmm. China is waiting for the rotten fruit to drop into their lap.
Right, because the China. As you note, the story with China is just very different from the story with Russia, and the benefit of the knowledge economy and the benefit of the international or the liberal international project for China has just been staggering in terms of the alleviation of poverty. It's like one of the most important stories in the history of the world in terms of pulling just hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty and at least attending to their basic material circumstances. And so thinking about China, what is it about the institutions and the project of the liberal international order that China, at least at this stage, seems to be placing itself, again, not in such a hostile relationship as Russia, which is just, as you said, completely gone for broke on that, but still a very different relationship between the U.S. and China and the international system than there was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I mean, on the one hand, China, although we're very worried about Taiwan, we have every reason to be worried about Taiwan. We can take a little bit of reassurance in China's cautious approach. I think China would much rather let Taiwan naturally end up in its hands than to take a dramatic action, although the threat of taking a dramatic action of force is they certainly haven't abandoned that. But I think they would prefer not to. While Russia seems to think it can get expressive benefits through the exercise of force as it has done in Ukraine. So that's one difference. Another very interesting difference is that China is, on the case of the WTO, it's really trying to co-opt that so that the the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations have at least one through line in international trade, which is to get rid of the more formal part of the WTO, World Trade Organization, judicial system. And we do that on our own, with the Europeans in opposition to us. But we've succeeded in doing that. And China has responded to that by seeking to collaborate with the EU to create a substitute, ultimate judicial authority within the WTO, to replace the one that was created in 1995 and that the United States has gotten rid of. China is trying to create its own World Bank as a substitute for the more U.S.-dominated World Bank. Just looking at our own little world of law professors, China has really invested heavily in investment in trade, international law expertise in a way that Russia has pretty much completely neglected those fields. Russia still does national security and human rights, sort of the old school international law, and they have not been much of a player in trade and investment law as well. So, all this is consistent with the view that China has a long-term perspective, while Russia, for whatever reason, seems to find itself cornered, and the only path forward for Russia is to try and exploit divisions, both internationally and internally, that it sees in the West. This is kind of conjectural and overstated to look at the Crimean invasion as motivated in part by an attempt to drive a wedge between Germany and the United States. Mm-hmm. There are many other reasons as well, but I wouldn't neglect that as part of the explanation, to get the West back on its heels. While China has done very little to get the West back on its heels. Even our favorite story of the last 2 weeks, the balloon, that seems to have been a fairly innocuous intelligence operation, not a weapon system. Right. And I think generally, if you think about it, we think espionage promotes international stability rather than undermining it. Although there's a lot of passion and rhetoric right now about the balloons, my own view is I guess we're doing the same thing. I hope we are.
Right, we better be, right. That's not to get sidetracked, but that's such an interesting perspective from folks who think about national security, right? That the broader public might not get, that espionage actually promotes security, because of course, when everybody knows what everybody else is up to, they're less likely to get into like accidental conflict with each other, or start lobbying bombs at another person, expecting them because they were about to attack when they weren't about to attack, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, okay, maybe we just to transition this a little bit to the subject of the podcast more generally, which is environmental matters. You talk about climate change a little bit in the book, and just to add a little bit of context here, to because we've been talking about geopolitics and trade and internet, domestic conflict and dissent. Really, a lot of kind of the environment of politics these days, and how does climate change fit into this story? And international and global pollution and global environmental issues generally. Climate change is just the leading example. There are fisheries. There's plastics pollutions. There's other issues that we care about. Biodiversity. There's other issues we care about. So I think if I was going to tell a story, an international liberalism story, or how climate change fits into that, it would be something like, at the same time that we were negotiating this newest version of the liberal order with the WTO expansions and the fall of the Soviet Union and integration of China into the global trade regime, we're also aware of the problem or becoming increasingly aware of the problem of climate change. And the solution that the kind of policy elite reached for very naturally was was integrated into this mindset, this way of thinking, that we were going to use global institutions, we were going to negotiate a treaty, and you could think of the trade freedoms, goods, services, capital, and people. Well, we were just going to essentially add carbon into that. We were going to create carbon markets that would actually be global. We were going to coordinate globally our efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions, move emissions reductions to the cheapest places, just like we move the production of everything to the cheapest places, and kind of shake out the distributional consequences of that. But the kind of the theory of addressing climate change that was prevalent for quite a while was very consistent with the institutions that you describe as liberal internationalism. And obviously that hasn't worked out at all. We don't have a global, really any kind of serious global system to address climate change. There's the Paris Agreement. We can talk about that. Obviously, there's huge amounts of internal dissent along partisan lines on appropriate climate policy in the States, somewhat less so in Europe, although I think, that can still be on the table to a certain extent. And so I guess the question back to you is, how do you see the current moment kind of informing what path we should take moving forward on addressing climate change, which is truly a global problem in scale, and it's not clear how, without some forms of global cooperation, we're ever going to really get our way out of this?
Yeah, I agree completely. So I think we start with the claim that it is a collective action problem and that some kind of solution that involves coordinating behavior and creating the right incentives for desirable behavior is essential. It is, I think, a problem where it's hard to see how a single leader state could all on its own fix it. I mean, I think the most we can hope for is to create incentives for particular states to come up with innovative solutions. You know, I think and I'm not the technologist that you are, Michael, and there's a lot I don't know, but my impression is that if you don't think the right solution is closing down the industrial modern economy,
right, which no one does.
Yeah. Then we have to come up with technological innovations and then apply them to fix this. And perhaps as part of the solution, creating for incentives for states to innovate with these technologies and tolerating rewarding them for their innovations. So to get a little more law-oriented and concrete, I see this kind of as the path from Rio to Paris. So I think Rio was still informed by a sort of international agreement on commitments that would have something of a legal nature and aspiring to more. So it was somewhat top down in its aspirations, although maybe not in its realizations. And what I like about Paris is it tries to sort out things we can do now and give some formality, some legal content to, from the things that we're just going to have to figure out. So as I understand Paris, and I know you have a much better grasp of it than I do, but just at a 30,000-foot level, what Paris does is mandate transparency but not commitments. And some people think that's a cop-out, and maybe it will turn out to be, but you can make an optimistic case for it as the transparency means we know what other people are doing, including we may have a better idea of what other states are coming up with. And then we can, when we see what they can accomplish, we might be able to try and surpass them and create, a benign competitive environment about developing technologies that I think it would have to be a mix of carbon reduction and carbon capture. Reduction of the amount of carbon in the production process and new technologies that capture carbon that is extant in the world. And having some reward system, it doesn't have to be, rigid patents or anything like that, but to have one reward system so you don't have to wait till you go to heaven to be rewarded for coming up with breakthroughs in these technologies. And at the same time, hoping that we can come up with distributional effects so that countries that do the technological breakthroughs, groups that do the technological breakthroughs, will be able to transfer their technology without withholding it too much from other parts of the world that need to adapt it as well. Right. This is the problem we have with pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, that as we saw with COVID, right? We want to make the vaccines available to everyone because we need herd immunity on a global basis. But, we don't want to give away the vaccines for free because then we won't get vaccines. And I think that basic concept applies to the kind of innovations we need for both carbon reduction and carbon extraction technologies. And also, as I mentioned in the book, we need monitoring because One problem we have right now, I think, is there's too much scamming about carbon offsets that are really, it seems to me, some of them at least are kind of phony. But we need to identify people who are really successful at reducing carbon and reward them. And we need technologies to, distinguish the scams from the accomplishments.
Yeah, I think so that's helpful. So I'm going to be the pessimist. You get to be the pessimist throughout most of the book. So I'm going to be the pessimist on this a little bit, which is, so I don't see the dealing with climate change as kind of exclusively a technological problem. So, for example, there's a lot of technologies that we know that we could deploy right now that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions at pretty low costs, actually, around the world. And with respect to carbon capture and storage, someone has to pay for that, right? And there's always this problem, which is the United States or any actor, California, Europe, China, whoever, any carbon that they reduce, any carbon that they don't emit or any carbon that they suck out of the atmosphere and store, the percentage of the benefits that they get from that activity, reducing emissions or storage or capture and storage, is small compared to the benefits that are generated, right? Because the benefits go to the whole global community. And this is just the nature of the public good problem of climate change as a global externality. And so so there's always this problem of who's going to pay for this stuff, and without a global regime of some kind that either caps emissions or places a price on carbon or places some kind of compensatory price that pays for carbon capture and storage, it's just very, very hard to imagine how any of that would ever get deployed, or even if the technologies existed, and then of course the technologies aren't going to really get created until there's a financial system in place that will reward their ultimate deployment. So this is the tricky thing, I think, where we find ourselves in. Now, part of, I take your reasoning to be like, look, we have to also take the reality of the international system and where it is and where it's likely to be, in the at least the medium term, and we can do what we can do, but we can't do more than we can do. So let's think about how we can at least leverage the tools at our disposal as best we can, and not bemoan the fact that we can't do some other thing that might be great in an ideal world. So I guess that's kind of my question is, do you see the next stage as kind of an intermediary period where we'll maybe fund some technological development? Some countries will do some decarbonization, some more, some less, but not really under an incentive structure that's going to properly give incentives to do those activities at an efficient level or at a good, at a socially beneficial level. And then we move eventually to a where we hope that there will be a reconsolidation of the international order such that we could try to manage a more robust form of global cooperation? Or is it just, is that the idea, the long-term idea, or we just need to do it as best we can with what we can right now and just we'll see how the future shakes out?
Well, I think ultimately all we can do is the best we can. But let me throw out a few conceptual ideas that push back a little bit on what you've said, although I largely agree with you. But this is the point I would make, that if we conceive of the problem as a pure public goods problem, and we acknowledge that we're operating under a very flawed market for the government piece of the puzzle is very flawed, we're doomed, right? That if the only solution ultimately is by government provision, yet we are living in a world of government failure, boy, that's tough. Mm-hmm. So maybe we need to think about this in another way. And one of the interesting, this is where, at least metaphorically, I think the story of the knowledge economy might come into play. For many years, people like Marshall, people like Solov thought that technological innovation was a public good, and that ultimately you had to look to government to provide it, or at least create an environment that didn't get in the way. And I think Paul Romer's, Nobel Prize-winning insight was actually you can incompletely monetize, but technological innovation, but you can give technological innovation enough of a quality of an asset as to make investment rational, even if you don't capture all of the benefits of that investment, that there is always with knowledge some leakage, but also some ways to learn from doing in a way that you can be for a long time the technological leader. And if we apply that model to combating excess carbon in the atmosphere, well, somebody has to pay for carbon extraction, but if you are the leader in developing technologies, you can imagine a world where you can sell those technologies, either by outright or by lease, and you can also, by investing in developing those technologies, learn how to do other things for which you'll get rewarded. I can't say that's guaranteed, and so this is to some extent an expression of hope rather than a confident prediction. But I do think that if we think of creating a world where incentives are more likely to work to induce people to invest in carbon extraction and carbon reduction, we can get there sooner than relying on a system that's afflicted by government failure. And I think Paris is a roadmap towards that kind of world, although it's by no means inevitable.
Yeah, great. So, yes, it's very interesting, and you have to take the point at some level that if the global institutions just aren't up to the task, we have to have to find somewhere else to go, right? That's just that if you just find a river that you can't cross, you have to find a place to ford, so to speak. Okay, just thinking about some of these institutions and maybe the next 10, 15, 20 years. One of the potential issues that you raise, or the kind of forecasts that you make, are that the EU itself and the WTO are very much imperiled. That these are institutions that they're at risk. That maybe France could leave the EU. That would obviously be the disaster for the entity. So one question I have is just a little bit like, maybe these institutions, what's the natural life cycle of these? I guess that's the question. So maybe when they were, as the European Union institutions were being created and consolidated, as the WTO was being created, there was an idea that these would be very, very, very long-lived institutions. I think you can actually correct, you know much more about this than I do, but my impression is that folks at the time saw these as bedrock institutions that were going to structure international relations for a very long time. What we're learning maybe is that they were temporary. They were part of a system that existed for some time. They served a function, and maybe there's just other institutions that are going to kind of come into being that will better serve the world that we live in now. And I guess the question is, like, how should we feel about that? Should we mourn the WTO? Should we mourn the European Union if that's the way things are going? Or should we just accept that they served a useful function for a particular moment in global history, and now there's going to be other institutions or other ways of interacting, at least, that hopefully will serve some of the same functions?
Yeah, so here I'm a Schumpeterian, if that's a word. That's to say creative destruction, and I don't see why it shouldn't apply to international institutions as much as it applies to most human social enterprises. And let me make what may be a far-fetched analogy, which is to the U.S. constitutional system. We made our Constitution formally extremely hard to amend. But of course, we don't see rigidity. Indeed, we have an ongoing rewriting of our Constitution every time the Supreme Court is in session. And I think those two things are related. So with international organizations, the formal barrier to change is, because they're treaty-based and because multilateral treaties typically require unanimity, there are a lot of veto points that make formal change of those institutions, whether it's the WTO or the EU, really hard. But as we've seen from, the U.S. approach to constitutional revision, there are other ways of adaptation, and we can hope that those institutions can survive adapted. So, if you think, for example, that the WTO system needs to revert to something closer to the pre-1995 general agreement system, which provided a lot of the same services, but without quite the legal rigidity. I mean, we can do that without, closing down the WTO headquarters in Geneva. We just, what the United States has already done with the so-called appellate body, the Ultimate Court of Appeals in the WTO. I mean, we working within the system, we've destroyed that. And many people deplore that. But maybe that's really the right way to go. Another thing that's happened in the WTO that I write about, that the United States has embraced a position that the first part of which I think is pretty solid, which is national security is a trump, and B, national security is whatever we say it was, which was actually embraced by the Trump administration, but has not been disavowed by the Biden administration. Now, from a formal perspective, that argument destroys the whole value of the system. What good is rules if any country can give itself a get-out-of-free card by saying national security, which is whatever we say it is? On the other hand, that can lead arguably to a different equilibrium, but not necessarily anarchy. There are disincentives to invoking national security. You're losing opportunities to cooperate with other states. You're losing the opportunity to call out other states. So the fact that this pull the plug option exists doesn't necessarily mean that it will dominate the system. Now that's a WTO system as an example. The EU, how well will it adapt? I mean, it's facing real challenges and a change of government. France, for example, is, I think, the most likely. Another election in 4 years, and the Front National has gained every time it's been in contention. On the other hand, the EU might adapt itself to the point where it's no longer the bugbear that makes it worthwhile for the Front National to call for withdrawal from the So there are ways of adaptation other than amending the treaty itself. And our hope is that the participants in these particular clubs can find pathways to respond to the challenges that enhance their survivability. I mean, that's certainly what I would like. My fundamental argument is that doubling down on the importance of your status as an international organization and the importance of international law as a formal matter, that doubling down, I feel, is not often the right pathway to survival.
Well, these are incredibly weighty matters, and the book it's very illuminating. Obviously, listeners should give it a read if you're interested in these questions, which we all should be. Paul, thanks so much for having written the book, and thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you, Michael. This has been terrific. I'm in your debt.
And listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, let us know. You can give us a like, a rating, subscribe to the podcast, and follow us on social media. It'd be great to hear from you. Till next time.